Well, hello everybody and welcome to this webinar on breaking into law as a career changer. My name is Ruth Barron and I'm the National Careers Advisor at the College of Law. Before we start this webinar, I recognise that many of us viewing today are on different lands of different traditional custodians. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I live, learn and work, the Gadigal and Wongal. I acknowledge that the presence and cultures of all of our First Peoples are vital to this nation that we share, Australia, and pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. We have a few guidelines for our webinar today. Please show courtesy to your colleagues and experts today as you would in a face-to-face event. Please submit your questions via the Q&A function. This session is being recorded and will be shared with participants afterwards. If you lose connection, you can log back in using the same meeting details provided. And please take the time at the end to complete a quick survey on the session and any ideas you may have for other webinars. We'd love to hear from you. I'm just going to stop share now and introduce our subject matter expert for today's program. Please welcome Kathy Bedford, Early Intervention Lead at the Victorian Legal Services Board and Commissioner, and Luke Shane, Community Lawyer at Senior Rights Victoria. I'm going to start with Kathy and then go to Luke, but I'm wondering if you can introduce yourselves, please.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. This is a great opportunity to talk about something I'm pretty passionate about, and that's the fact that change is good. So I've pretty much every 10 years of my professional life had a major career change. I started out as a nurse and worked as a general nurse for about 10 years, and I worked in media and radio as a journalist. I presented the ABC Radio Statewide Drive program for nearly 10 years. Towards the end of that 10 years, I started studying law, and I commenced in a graduate lawyer role with Morris Blackburn Lawyers and worked there for nearly 7 years, reaching senior associate status. And in the last 6 months have had a further change. I'm now working as a lawyer at the Victorian Legal Services Board. So as you'll all come to know, that's the organisation that regulates and licenses lawyers.
Thanks, Kathy. And Luke, if you could introduce yourself too.
Good afternoon. Like Kathy, I've changed careers a few times. I've worked in the media as well. I'm not sure if I mentioned to Kathy, but I worked at a radio station in Sydney for a little while. Also worked in the music industry before moving into community services sector, where I worked with the Office of the Public Advocate for a 15-year period in a variety of different roles. I then moved to the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing in Victoria, where I worked on the Disability Royal Commission team, their Disability Royal Commission team as a senior policy officer, before moving to Seniors Rights Victoria, where I'm now working as a community lawyer. I've been with Seniors Rights for about 3 months, and it's my first legal role.
Great. Look, welcome to you both. I'm going to start with a question for both of you. So whoever jumps in first gets to answer it first. I see lots of students and graduates who are trying to pivot into law with previous careers in other industries. What are your top 2 tips or pieces of advice for anyone trying to use their diverse experience to pivot into law?
You can go first, Luke.
Thanks, Kathy. So I think it's important to analyse your experience. As lawyers or legal students, you should have some analytical skills that you've built up over the years, and to think about how it could translate into law. So the example that I often think of is if you have what you might think is completely unrelated experience, it might be in sales. When you come to an interview, if you can explain to your potential employer that you have familiarity with contracts and you can translate that experience into a legal context, then you're going to be in a better position than somebody like me who's come from essentially a government background or community services background who doesn't have those skills. The second piece of advice that I would give is to aim high. And to not be afraid of rejections and try not to take them personally. I've always taken the view that job search is a numbers game. the more applications that you put out there, the more chances you'll have. But unfortunately, the more rejections you'll get. But I think when you're aiming high, you can not be so affected by those rejections, because you know that you're applying for something that might be a little bit outside your comfort zone.
I think
Thanks,
that's
Luke.
Yeah, great advice, Luke. And mine will be pretty similar. Number one, I guess I would just say you've got to really believe that it's never too late, and it is really good to have a change. And you've got to believe that, or you will just give up when you're getting those rejections from jobs. But it is possible to pivot and start a whole new career, and I'm certainly an example of that. So number two, and this is very similar to Luke's, is to really look at your life's experience and know and really believe that all life experience is valuable. And in my own experience, I think that employers actually value life experience, and they'll put that ahead of someone who's coming straight out of uni who hasn't really done much with their lives to date. So look at what you've done, even if it's, my example would be, if you're working at a supermarket, you will have developed people skills. There's no doubt that you'll have dealt with people from all kinds of backgrounds. And so think about that and how you can use those skills, word them up beautifully in your CV to show that you actually do have really valuable life skills that can be, that can relate to the area of law that you wish to pursue.
It's that storytelling of your career, I think, that becomes important. Both of you have mentioned rejections, though. How did you deal with those inevitable knockbacks that you got along the way?
I was pretty lucky in that there weren't too many rejections. And I don't know if that's just because I, had this fabulously worded CV that made me sound fabulous, but I think as an older person, and I don't know if there are older people listening on this call, you do hear a lot that there is a bit of an age bias. And when I was starting to apply for positions, I was really worried about, how do I make my CV not tell the true story of my life, and that I'm, at that time I was in my mid-40s. So you have to word your CV carefully, and you hope that it'll get you the interview. And then at the interview, it's about selling yourself. But there is that nervousness, that there is a bit of an ageism out there. But I say again, my experience is people actually do value life experience. So with age comes experience. So just don't give up.
Yeah. What about you, Luke?
If I could just pick up on that comment about age quickly, I feel like being a slightly more mature lawyer or new lawyer helped me secure my job at Seniors Rights Victoria, because we work with older people, and I feel that my resume might have been a little more attractive because I wasn't fresh from college moving into that role. But in terms of dealing with rejection, I had accepted before I'd started my job search that I would receive a number of rejections. I was working in a senior policy role with the Victorian government, and I didn't want to take a step back in my salary. So the equivalent roles for me to apply for in the legal sector were 2-year post-qualification experience roles. And I knew that I was applying for these jobs without that experience. So I expected to get rejected from every single job. The way that I dealt with that was to refine my process in applying, and perhaps we'll get to that a little later in the session today. And then also to have a backup plan. So I was willing to try that idea of aiming high for a particular period of time, and then I knew that I'd step back and apply for lower level roles if I couldn't secure a job at that salary level.
Which actually leads very nicely, Luke, onto a question that's been asked, which is, should you ignore the post-admission experience requirements in job ads if you have professional experience in the field that you are looking to practice in? And I think you have a very good example of that when you were told that you should start at graduate lawyer level when you applied, which would have been half your current salary. So maybe fill me in on that and fill the people in on the call.
Yeah, so when I was working with the Victorian government, I organised a meeting with a senior lawyer in an adjacent team, and she had told me that my way to break into law was to take a level 2 graduate position and to take a rotation around the Victorian government with a family to support and a desire to earn a decent wage. I couldn't entertain that. So I think I had to realise that not all advice is good advice. and that's something that you might want to take into account today and think about whether the advice that we're giving you fits your circumstances. But look, I looked at the years of experience that were required for certain roles, and I absolutely wasn't going to apply for a role with a requirement of 5 years post-qualification experience. But I thought that for the right role, I could try and sell myself into a 2 years post-qualification experience role if I had the right experience.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. That's really good advice.
On that specific question about ignoring the post-admission experience requirements in a job ad, I wouldn't ignore it, but I've been in this situation applying for jobs where it asks for specific experience. I'd sort of acknowledge, you know, they're going to see from your CV that you don't have that requirement. So in my cover letter, I'd usually say, you know, I don't have this, but look at all this kind of thing. So you're balancing it out. You're saying, you know, you should consider me because I have all of this other experience that is clearly relevant here.
Kathy, though, you applied for graduate positions and got one at Maurice Blackburn. So this is actually a bit different in the sense that you were going back to 0 years of post-qualification experience. What were some of the most important attributes you needed to get into a graduate program at a firm like Maurice Blackburn?
I think that process, it's very much a tick box. So even though you might have the most fabulous CV, they are going to be, to get you kind of across the line or on the shorter list to be looked at, it does come down to academic record. For Maurice Blackburn and those sorts of social justice law firms, I think they are looking that you've done volunteer work, that you've got a commitment to social justice type causes. So you need to sort of think about building your background experience to fit the law firm that you want to work at. Is probably very different at a more commercial law firm, but that's where, again, if you've got the relevant experience, you'll be able to tick those boxes for them. And then it's getting across the line to get an interview, and we probably will come to that, but I think that's where you have to think about, you want to present to them the kind of person that they'd like to employ, so you can have absolute confidence and belief in yourself. But if you come across as someone who has all that confidence, but perhaps isn't, for a graduate program especially, isn't able to be trained or can't come in and learn new things, then they're not going to consider you for that sort of graduate program, because you are starting at the bottom. And I was very aware of that, almost addressing that as the elephant in the room. Yes, I'm mature, I've got all this experience, but I have a humility and I'm keen to learn, and I know I've got a lot to learn, so that they can look at you as someone that they'd be prepared to take on and teach.
I think we described this earlier as being malleable, being able to be adaptable to what's being given to you as a lawyer. Luke, did you find that as well, that you had to be malleable at interview stage, perhaps?
Yeah, and I was just thinking about Kathy's comment then. I had to strike that balance between selling myself confidently, but also acknowledging that there were a lot of areas of knowledge and experience that I lacked, and being able to communicate that I was prepared to build up that knowledge reasonably quickly. So I remember saying that in my interview, that one of my strengths was some highly relevant experience, but a weakness was perhaps not being able to apply that experience in a lawyer's role, and needing guidance around it.
Yeah, and I think that is very important. But I also wonder too, do you think that age was a factor in the decision-making process when you were applying for roles? Did it change the way you applied, and do you think it changed the way the law firms or the organisations looked at you?
Yeah, so I think it helped me secure my role with Seniors Rights Victoria. I think that Seniors Rights Victoria were happy to have somebody with a little bit of a shine on the top of their head meet with their clients. I think that the experience, the non-legal experience, is beneficial because you're demonstrating to an employer that you've applied yourself to previous roles, and I was able to highlight my successes and how I developed my non-legal career, and they could obviously translate that to a legal role.
Kathy, I wonder too, for you being in a graduate program, how did your age compare to the other graduates in the program?
I was like the mother of the group, so I was a whole lot older. They weren't all straight out of, they were mostly people who had life experience, but I'd say in late 20s, early 30s, whereas I was getting up into my late 40s at that stage. So way older. And so I'm really grateful to Maurice Blackburn for giving me that opportunity. But again, I think it's about selling yourself as someone who has got something to offer. And it was a real bonus to them that I could meet with clients and they didn't think they were, you know, if they asked, I'd tell them, but they didn't necessarily think they were getting the junior lawyer because I looked like I had the maturity. So that was an advantage, I think. And it's just about finding those qualities and the life experience to sell yourself. But that your word that you used earlier, you know, that initial thing of getting the interview and showing that you are malleable, because going into a grad program like that, it is all about learning and you're going to rotate through different teams and, you know, they don't want someone who thinks they already know everything because they've reached a certain age.
And another thing as well that we've got a question around, and I'm going to ask you, Luke, first, because you actually practiced in a particular area as a policy analyst or in policy, which assisted you because it was a very specific area that now you're practicing as a lawyer. So we've got a question about the fact that, you know, this person is mature age and they're finding the age bias to be an issue. But the bigger challenge is that they came back to the law for a very specific reason and they only want to work in dementia or mental health law. So how do you make opportunities in a specific field? I'm not sure if this person, though, already has experience in another way in that area, but I know that you did, Luke. So did that make it easier for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So a significant number of my cases at the moment deal with substitute decision-making, so powers of attorney, guardianship or administration. I was hired to work with the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing because of my experience at OPA, where I'd worked in guardianship and given advice, non-legal advice on powers of attorney. So that certainly helped. Just in terms of getting experience in that particular field, one of the great things about working in the community sector or the government sector is a lack of funding, and volunteers are always needed. And if you have the capacity to volunteer, there are a lot of organisations out there, the Mental Health Legal Centre, Seniors Rights Victoria, who are prepared to take on volunteers. There are also other ways of gaining relevant experience or demonstrating to your employer that you're interested in that particular subject area. And it might be looking at other parallel volunteer roles. And because of my experience, I'm going to mention the Office of the Public Advocate's community visitor program, where I had seen volunteers move from that role, or one particular volunteer moved from a role there to actually become the Deputy Public Advocate in Victoria and then now the Queensland Public Advocate.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm wondering, Kathy, do you have any comments on that? Because, I mean, you moved from being the presenter for the ABC Victoria statewide drive program. So I'm not sure how you were able to find skills, perhaps, for a specific area. I know that Maurice Blackburn has a particular bent, if that makes sense.
So, again, this is about really understanding the skills that you've developed through your life and figuring out how they can relate to a legal career. And when I really sat down and looked at my career trajectory, they'd always been in advocacy or caring roles. So nursing, looking after people. My role on the ABC, I saw very much as giving voice to regional people, regional issues. I did a lot of emergency broadcasting, that sort of thing. So I kind of knew that was never going to fit me to a commercial law career, and my interest has always been working with people. So I did very much channel my hopes and the process of applying for jobs to more social justice type law firms that advocate for a plaintiff rather than the bigger commercial law firms.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kathy. And I think that idea of having a fit for the actual job or the organisation that you're applying for does make a difference. And we have had a question about how do you find out about a lawyer's firm's business model. like Maurice Blackburn just mentioned, I'm assuming you did a bit of research before you applied for Maurice Blackburn, for example.
Absolutely. And having since been on interview panels and things, you can really see the people who have done their research and those who've just sent out a standard letter and have it. And most of the information is on law firms. If they're a big firm, they'll have a lot of information on their website. Their values is something really key to look at and understand. But yeah, asking around the industry, do your research. And I'm sure that's the same, Luke, for if you're going into government jobs, understand what that department does. It's been the same when I applied for the Legal Services Board. It was like, okay, what does this job really involve? What is the work of the Legal Services Board? And just doing your research. We're lawyers, you should have those skills.
I made a point of quoting Senior Right or COTA, the parent body's annual report in my interview, and also reading up on the 3 most recent newsletters that Seniors Rights Victoria had produced. So I just had the relevant issues at hand and ready to talk about if required.
And I'm assuming you're talking here about storytelling abilities or the ability to match your experience with the organisation that you're applying for. We have had a question about, what do you do? What type of roles can you go for when halving your salary isn't an option due to family commitments? Now, Kathy, I think that going to a graduate position would have meant a drop in salary for you. But Luke, I think as we touched on before, you were able to get in at a higher level because of your previous experience and being able to demonstrate that. So I'll leave it to Kathy first and then to Luke, perhaps, to answer that.
Yeah, look, I think I was lucky that I was in a position where I could take a drop in salary. And let's be honest, the ABC didn't pay that much anyway, so it wasn't a huge drop in salary. And I think that was just the path at the time that I took, knowing I wanted to work at Maurice Blackburn, really. But, perhaps if I'd had more confidence and belief in myself, I could have held out and kind of said, no, I've already got the skills. I would have had to put myself through the PLT, which was provided through the graduate program. So there's that sort of payoff. But if you're putting yourself through PLT and then applying as an admitted lawyer and you've got a heap of life skills, well, I think that's completely an option. But for me, I kind of knew the path I wanted to go, and yeah, that's where I went, and it did mean a bit of a cut in pay.
Definitely.
I think it's really interesting thinking about different perspectives. I didn't have the confidence to apply to a graduate program in a private law firm.
Yeah, but you did have confidence and to apply for the one that you did based on your experience.
Yeah, look, I thought I was trying it on. I mentioned earlier that I see job search as essentially a numbers game. I knew that it was going to take a while. It probably took about 3 months of solid job search to find the role with Seniors Rights Victoria. It was about being able to face those rejections. And I think what's interesting is that as I started to refine my job search process, and unlike Kathy, I did that whilst I was applying, towards the end of my job search process, my resume was tighter, my approach to employers was tighter as well. And I was getting interviews for roles that were outside of my area of experience. So, for example, I got an interview that I didn't attend because I'd been offered the job with Seniors Rights Victoria that was working on a major government infrastructure project.
As a lawyer?
As a lawyer, yes.
Interesting. And the role that you got, were there different factors that you think helped you get that role? For example, contacting the contact person.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a complete nerd about applying there. I had 15 years of experience in substitute decision making, and I knew that a lot of the work that Seniors Rights Victoria did was along those lines. So I made a point of calling the principal and talking to her about my experience. I pre-prepared a spiel, essentially wrote out my selling points. I practiced that with my wife before I called. And they asked me to send in a resume that night. They asked me to send in a resume. I sent it in that night, and I got a call for an interview the first thing in the morning. I think what was also attractive to them, as I've become aware of funding situations in community legal centres, is that I had offered to take a slightly lower salary than what was advertised. So perhaps they saw that they were getting a better deal. Now, that lower salary was still an equivalent to my previous salary, so I didn't need to take that step back. But I think in answer to the question, it was being prepared to wait a while before moving into law.
And as you say, honing your job search as you went and your applications. For both of you, I think for Kathy, you already said when you were applying, you'd taken that initiative to create a CV that demonstrated your skills and experience and how you matched the firm. Luke, did that take some time for you? And Kathy, any recommendations on how people can do that?
I'd say, look, hopefully if you're studying law, you're pretty good with language and you know yourself better than anyone, but it doesn't hurt to make your own start at putting down what you see as all the key life skills that you've gained through your various life experience. And I notice there's a few people asking about experience that they've gained overseas. All experience is valuable. So just because it's overseas, don't, leave that out of your CV. But getting some professional help to help word that up and make it a pretty, slick looking CV that doesn't go on for 10 pages. You want it to hit the punch in a couple of pages, but really tell your story.
Yeah.
So I think I started applying before I was prepared to start applying because I wasn't happy in my previous role and I wanted to build the momentum. I wanted to start my job search. That was important for me, I guess, for my own mental health. So I did admittedly start it with probably my resume, I think, was way too long. But over a period of weeks, I cut that down and I was happy with what I was doing. And I guess I'd look back, I would use my applications in the previous week or cover letters in the previous week for the current applications. And I would see issues in those letters and just refine them over time. But I think Kathy's approach is better.
I think each approach is different. It achieved what you needed to do at the time, which is important. I think, though, that perhaps you gave yourself more time to be able to achieve something from it. I'm quite conscious that we have a number of questions here that I'd love to get to some of them in the next 5 minutes. Some of them are actually quite specific, and because of that, I don't think we're going to get to all of the questions today. There's a couple of questions here about being an international student. I think there are some other ones also about should I gain experience. I'm going to answer that myself and say that any experience you can get in a legal setting in Australia will help you to move on to getting a paid legal role, whether it's voluntary or paid. Any experience in Australia is good. That's for that question about international students. We've had a question too about whether for people who are older that may not have had a chance to do internships, is it still worth applying for grad positions at larger firms? Now, Kathy, I think you might be the case in point here, so I'll leave that one for you.
Well, I can just quickly answer. Some of the big law firms don't actually do the seasonal clerkships, and they want people who have put themselves through PLT to take you on at that point. So different firms, some have grad programs. I think most of the grad programs feed through the seasonal clerkships. I assume that's what you mean by internships. It's probably still worth applying, but you're going to be up against it because they've had probably 3 rotations of seasonal clerks come through, and that's really your 3-week job interview to then go on to hopefully get into the grad program. But other law firms don't do the seasonal clerkships and will be just looking to employ grad lawyers. So it just can vary. And again, pick up the phone, ring the HR department at the law firms, do your research, ask questions, and they'll soon be able to tell you.
I think asking questions and exploring your network is really important. So I did an internship before I moved into a paralegal role with the Office of the Public Advocate. I took my final subject as part of my JD as an internship, and I feel like that was the springboard that helped me get my current role.
Yeah, very good advice there, I think, as well, to try and get that experience. We've got a question here as well about someone who's not concerned about the pay, but would like to work in a place that they believe in. And I have a feeling that both Kathy and Luke, you believe in the place that you work at. So I don't know how this question is, the person doesn't know how to work that out, to be honest. Any suggestions? And I think, Kathy, you've answered the second part of their question, which is about graduate programs that are suitable for mature people. I think that this person feels a bit shy about being the oldest person there.
Don't be shy, but yeah, just doing your research. And if it is a smaller law firm and you want to, you know, if you do get a job interview, be confident to ask them questions too about their workplace culture. And when I applied for the job with the Legal Services Board, it was very important to me that they had a positive workplace culture, because I think that's really important for job satisfaction. And so I asked about that at my job interview, and they sent me their employment engagement survey results for the last year. So those sorts of things you can do, you know, ask them questions about the things that matter to you about different law firms. But a lot of the information will be on their websites, you know, and obtainable if you just start asking around.
Yeah, very true. Kathy, did you have any comments to make on that at all, Luke?
Yeah, I think this goes back to our first question. It's about, you know, doing a bit of an analysis of you as an applicant, and looking at your values and looking at what's important to you in a role, and then trying to find organisations that share those values. I think you'll find that if you're looking at working in the community sector, most people have the time and are prepared to talk to folks who are interested in joining that sector. Don't be afraid to call an organisation and ask them the questions that you feel that you need answered before you apply for a job there. And don't be afraid to ask people for advice.
I'd agree with that totally, Luke. And it's the organisation, anybody that you know that might have worked or is working in that organisation. I've also heard of people ringing up the contact person in government roles and getting a really good insight into how to apply for those particular roles, which can be a bit difficult when you're on the outside of that as well. There's a couple of questions here about the fact that we've suggested that you know, you can do voluntary work to get experience. One of those is this idea of getting a second gig, so doing legal work 1 or 2 days a week and then working in their role, you know, the other days. Any tips for mature law graduates looking to apply for a law job as a casual role or as a second gig?
That's effectively what I did with the Office of the Public Advocate. I took on the internship and then the paralegal role. And for a period, I was also working on the Office of the Public Advocate's advice service. So I'd taken a step back to work in that role so that I could focus on my studies and the legal work. So I essentially ran 2 slightly different careers in the same organisation alongside each other. I think it's important to know that volunteering doesn't have to be 5 days a week or even 2 days a week. When you put that you have been a volunteer at a community legal centre, you could be attending 1 night a fortnight. And you won't necessarily be pressed on how many hours you're putting into that volunteering work. It's more about the period of time that you've been engaged with that organisation.
I'd just add that I think there is value in doing roles like the paralegal roles, the legal assistant type roles. You'll gain great experience. It might feel like, but I've done my law degree and I should be able to get something more. But if you can do that as a transition role, I think it is well regarded, and you might end up, I know there were a lot of people at Morris Blackburn who went through that path, worked there as law clerks or legal assistants, learned a lot, and then eventually proved themselves and got jobs as lawyers. On the volunteering, I think what Luke has said is really interesting, that there's a lot of government departments where you can volunteer. People probably tend to think a little bit narrowly about community legal centres, that sort of place, but try and think more broadly and, directly approach places that you think might be a good fit to you if you are looking for a volunteer opportunity.
Just think it's really important to know that you're not going to upset people by asking questions. And if you are upsetting them by asking questions, then you probably don't want to work there.
Good tip.
Very good. Yeah, very true, Luke. And that's just answered a question from here as well, which is, as a recently admitted lawyer, should I also consider roles as a paralegal or a law clerk to get my foot in the door? Thank you, Kathy. That was a yes for that one. That's a very good idea to get some experience.
I have to acknowledge that it did hit my ego to work as a paralegal after graduating. My supervisor was kind enough to put in brackets after my title, law graduate. Which helped me.
Nice.
Yeah, that is lovely. And I guess that's something else to consider too, is that, you know, when you are taking those sorts of roles, you may be able to negotiate on title, even though, you know, you may not be able to negotiate on salary, for example. It may be something that you can negotiate once you're offered the position. Look, there are some very specific questions that were being asked on this side here too, but one of the questions that I might ask, one of the last ones, is curious to know for those on the hiring side, as a mature age, what weight of importance is given to previous experience versus uni marks versus prestige of the graduating university? I'm not sure if either of you can answer that question.
I had prepared to give my marks, which I thought were quite good, to Seniors Rights Victoria. I'm very surprised that they didn't. I was disappointed that they didn't ask for them. I think that they were more interested in my experience and the answers that I gave in the interview rather than the marks that I scored at uni.
Yeah.
I think it depends on the job you're going for. I think with the graduate programs, it's such a competitive process, and it is just a tick box. They'll line up, okay, this person's in the top, you know, marks category. I don't think prestige of uni is so much, well, it probably depends on the law firm. Some law firms, a little bit of an old boys club that, you know, dad went to that uni, so therefore we like graduates of that particular uni. But my experience, that wasn't such a big issue. But I think for those graduate roles, it certainly is a tick box. They look at your past experience, they look at your marks, not so much the name of the university you went to, but it all is part of the kind of balance, with no particular bias, I don't think, for any one over the other.
Yeah. Thank you, Kathy. I think that's very true. And I think also it probably depends on where you're applying. Some good places to look for jobs is one of the questions. I'm not sure if that person has looked on the College of Law jobs board, but there are lots of entry level and sometimes a few years PQE experience roles on the College of Law jobs board. I'd highly recommend looking there if you haven't found anything yet. And one more question I'm going to go for is that, having decided to be enrolled in the Masters of Family Law, when I start looking for work, is this a good selling point in applications? I'm not sure if either of you can answer that. I'm not sure if either of you have gone on to do further study following your PLT.
I'd say I haven't, but I'd say that shows a commitment to that area of law, which I think would be highly regarded. So use that as a sell point. It tells them that you really are interested in that area of law and you're prepared to do further study.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with that. Although I think whenever I suggest this in career consultations, I'm struck with the people going, I've just studied 5 years at university or however long it's taken them to finish and done my PLT. I don't want to enroll in a master's, but study is always going to be beneficial to demonstrate your interest. On that note as well, for anyone who is a College of Law student on the call or graduate, you can book in for consultations with me or Susan Pincus. We are the career coaches at the College of Law. On that note, I am
Ruth, can I just interject to say that I would highly recommend doing that. I put my ability to secure the role and to build the confidence to get the role that I had down to Ruth. I had a consultation with Ruth and it really helped me think about how I was going to approach that application.
Thanks, Luke. Hopefully there are others out there who feel the same too. But as I said, anyone who is a student of the College of Law or graduate can book in for free consultations with me or Susan. So I'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining today's webinar. I hope you found it useful. You can apply the tips and insights to aid your journey in practice. A big thank you to Kathy Bedford and to Luke Shane. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. Alternatively, you can follow us on socials and you can join our College Connect alumni community to keep up with upcoming webinars. I'm going to post in the chat a survey question here. You can give your feedback in our survey. It'd be great if you could do that. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your day and hope to see you next time. Bye for now, everybody.